bold but wise. Though there are times when it may be wise not to comment publicly about our faith, in general, we are to be bold and open in our Christian witness. Here's Dr. Gene Getz.
That principle comes from the events that are happening in terms of particularly the persecution that is taking place in Jerusalem against Jesus Christ by those who are rejecting him and what he's saying. So let's take a look at that. Let's look in at this, where Jesus is now in Jerusalem. This is picking up the continuity of the fact that he's there during this time of the feasts of tabernacles or booths. And this is what we read in verse 28 of chapter 7. As he was teaching in the temple, Jesus cried out, "You know me, and you know where I am from. Yet I have not come on my own, but the one who sent me is true. You don't know him. I know him because I am from him, and he sent me." Then they tried to seize him. This is a very hostile environment. Yet no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. However, many from the crowd believed in him and said, "When the Messiah comes, he won't perform more signs than this man has done, will he?" Well, notice what happens. The Pharisees heard the crowd murmuring these things about him, and so the chief priests and the Pharisees sent servants to arrest him. But the fact is, they couldn't arrest him. And notice that in verse 45, they're being challenged by the Pharisees who sent them to arrest him. We read in verse 45, "Then the servants came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who asked them, 'Why didn't you bring him?' And the servants answered, 'No man ever spoke like this.'" Now we realize that there's a miraculous thing taking place here in these events, because God is sovereignly entering into this scene. Then you see the human dynamics, but you also see God's divine providence in making all of this happen. And it's all blending together as far as what's happening. So notice, then the Pharisees responded to them, "Are you fooled too? Have any of the rulers of the Pharisees believed in him?" And that question, by the way, reveals the fact that they're threatened, because they're saying, as members of the Sanhedrin, "What about the other Pharisees? Are they responding?" They believe they're losing their audience. They're losing their compatriots in their arguments against Jesus. And notice what happens. One of their own, we've met him before. His name is Nicodemus. Nicodemus, the one who came to him previously and who was one of them. One of them. That was his position. Probably a member of the 70, the Sanhedrin. A member of that group that sent the servants to capture Jesus. He said to them, "Our law doesn't judge a man before it hears from him and knows what he's doing, does it?" And they turned on him. "You aren't from Galilee too, are you?" In other words, you're not one of the men like those 12, all men of Galilee, that are following Jesus. You aren't from Galilee too, are you?" They replied. "Investigate, and you will see that no prophet arises from Galilee." Now, obviously what happened is that Nicodemus went silent because he's being highly threatened by his own people. At this point in time, we don't know what his spiritual status is, but I personally think that when he met Jesus that night and Jesus said, "You must be born again," really got his attention. Something's happening in his life. Maybe at this time, he's already a secret believer, because we know that after Jesus was nailed to the cross, he was a secret believer and took the body down. We'll see that when we come to that part of the Gospel of John. But the fact is that he is highly threatened, and because of that, he went silent. And I think we can understand that because there are many people in this world today who are experiencing some of the same things in relationship to threat, even on their own lives. And we need to be sensitive about that. Now, the fact is that there are times illustrated, even the lives of the apostles, that they couldn't be silent. But there's a unique context. They're in Jerusalem, and they are doing miracles, and they're taken into captivity. And in Acts chapter 5, and this is where it's recorded, this is, of course, after the church is born. And here's what these religious leaders were saying to these apostles. Didn't we strictly order you not to teach in this name? Look, you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and are determined to make us guilty of this man's blood. Now, to understand this, we need to underscore that word Jerusalem. Because Jesus said to them, when they said, are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel before he ascended? Jesus said, it's not for you to know the times or the seasons, but go back and wait in Jerusalem. And then he said, you'll understand because you are going to be my witnesses first in what? Jerusalem. And then in Judea, and then in Samaria, and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. This is Jerusalem. And to understand Jerusalem in the time of Jesus, the time of the apostles, we need to understand that the Roman Empire, the Roman emperor, had given the Jews virtually control over the people in Jerusalem and Judea. They had the freedom to practice their laws and to take care of issues. The one thing that they were not supposed to do was to take anybody's life because of what they felt was wrong. And that's why they went to Pilate and they went to the Romans to get permission to put Christ on the cross, because that was forbidden by Roman law. But they're in Jerusalem, and they're with the Sanhedrin, and they're with all of these individuals who Stephen stood before and gave his testimony, and they had him stoned, by the way, which was a violation of Roman law when they did that. But this was the context in which we read what the apostles said here in these verses. And let me just read that again so you get the continuity. Didn't we strictly order you not to teach in this name? Look, you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and are determined to make us guilty of this man's blood. Peter and the other apostles replied, we must obey God rather than people. Now, the reason I share that with you is that there's a context here in terms of law and what was happening in Jerusalem as far as the power that the Jews had. And what Peter and the other apostles are saying, you'd understand, you fellow Jews, the Sanhedrin, who you're over all of Jerusalem and Judea, Jesus has told us to witness to you, and we cannot be silent. Now, here's the important point of interpretation. You can't take that statement from Peter and the other apostles and universalize that to every culture of the world, even today, because there may be times, like Nicodemus and others, where we need to be cautiously silent. Because we're in a wholly different culture of the world that's ruled by evil people who, if we ever say a word about Jesus Christ, they will take your life. And so we have secret believers today who are struggling with some of those issues. We need to be sympathetic to that. And that's why I've worded this principle in this way. And let me just restate the principle. Though there are times when it may be wise not to comment publicly about our faith, at least like the apostles were doing, in general, we're to be bold and open in our Christian witness. Which leads us to this question, reflection response. How can we determine when to be silent about our faith in Jesus Christ and when to speak out boldly? Well, if I apply that to myself as a pastor in a country where I have freedom of speech, that I should never, ever compromise when I'm teaching and preaching a congregation about who Jesus Christ really is. And there are pastors today that are compromising that because they don't want to offend people. And I think what Peter said speaks to me, but in a culture of freedom. But the fact of the matter is, there may come a time, even in our culture, where we'll lose that freedom. Then we're going to have to make some really serious decisions in relationship to how to communicate the gospel of Jesus in a wise way. And see, this is what Paul was referring to in Colossians when he said this: act wisely towards outsiders. These are people that are living in the heart of the Roman world. They're living in a hostile environment. They're not in Jerusalem with Jews. They're in a pagan world with Gentiles and Roman rulers. Act wisely towards outsiders, making the most of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you should answer each person. And that's why Peter also said on one occasion, be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you the reason for the hope that you have. And basically, I think that these epistles are giving us guidelines, especially for people who are living in a very hostile environment. They need our prayers, and they need wisdom in how to respond, even to preserve their own families from death threats against them because they confess Jesus Christ. But there's something else that comes out of this which I think we can apply in every situation. And that is that we should never, ever, regardless of our environment, be ashamed to be a Christian, to be ashamed of Jesus Christ. Paul modeled that. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. And there are Christians living in our environment today. Unfortunately, and I don't want to be judgmental, they will not go into a restaurant and bow their heads and pray because they don't want anybody to know that they're spiritual. If that's the motivation, I think something's wrong with our faith. We should never, ever be ashamed of Jesus Christ. How we work that out depends on this principle. But it's still applicable in a very unique way when it comes to our faith in Christ. Let me just close again by reading this principle. Though there are times when it may be wise not to comment publicly about our faith, in general, we are to be bold and open in our Christian witness.